Thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I thought it'd be real uh, interesting to look back the last 2 years since eruption was over. We spent a lot of time talking about the eruption, done a lot of videos. We talked a lot of the deep details. It's been traumatic. This year we've got COVID going on, but really we want to look at what's happening after the eruption was over from 2 years ago all the way until today, right? Like all the questions we had after the last time it collapsed in August 2018. Looking forward, if we had a crystal ball at that moment, what would we see? And so today we're gonna be that crystal ball and show you guys what actually did happen in the following 2 years from that moment.
Right.
And so we're gonna try to keep it overall fairly tight and quick, not going into the details very much. We'll do that again, in future videos, and of course, you guys are all welcome to ask questions. We kind of start off by looking back at the changes that happened in the three places. At Fissure 8 vent, also known as Ahu'ailau, down where the lava was going to the ocean, which at the end of the eruption was near Pohoiki. So we're going to look at Pohoiki and how it changed as well. And then as well, the summit of Kilauea, the whole scarred landscape, the result of the whole collapse of the summit. We're going to look at that as well. So I'll turn it over to Dane to kind of, give us a visual and talk through a little bit some of those changes that happened, like, going back from August 2018 until today, really.
Right. And one extra bonus we're going to throw in is what changes have occurred on Mauna Loa, right? We're going to look at just some of the activity changes and the seismicity since then. So without further ado, let's kind of get into this video that we got on the end of Fissure 8, right? This is Ahu'ailau in Leilani Estates. This is in July, coming to an end. We're seeing in the winding down of the eruption. Right now, this was like the last day that lava was seen outside of the cone. So we have the collapse of the cone, but then we have this hornado and this resurgence of lava that comes back at the end of the eruption. You can see this cone is probably about 200 feet tall at this point in time. Comes back, it starts compressing after that. You can see the end of the eruption now, and then that little internal part collapsed inside the pit of Fissure 8. You can see afterwards the consistent steam and gas off of the back of the fissure. So now we're down to Pohoiki. You can see the end of the eruption down at the shoreline. Right here is second and third. Shacks and bowls, two surf spots, famous surf spots that were claimed by the 2018 eruption. Then it starts wrapping around Pohoiki into First Bay, and you can see the very beginning of the sand. Now we're back up at the summit and the changes that occurred up there. So there was the collapse explosions. There were 62 of them in total, and you could see each time it dropped multiple feet down. So by the end, it was 1,800 feet lower than it was previous to the eruption. We're going to go through each of these a little bit more detail. So without further ado, let's
Yeah.
get into that. I'll let you take over on the post collapse summit of Kilauea and the changes that have occurred up there.
Sure, yeah. So it was really a stunning sight to see after the collapses ended in 2018. And we had about a year of just a lot of fuming and steaming and wondering what's going to happen until finally in July of last year, we spotted water down there. And from July of last year, July, August, all the way till today, that pond of water has been filling at the bottom of Halema'uma'u. And we've kind of seen it expand. It's changed color as well. We've talked about that in some other videos. And so it continues filling. It's filling at a fairly slow rate. It's over halfway full to where we think it'll equalize with the water table surrounding that area. And so that it's already at a depth of over 40 meters, 140 feet or so. It's several football fields wide, and it's going to just keep growing and growing. It's really an amazing thing to see because really 2 years ago, well, a little more than that now, 2.5 years ago, this is a spot that had lava in it. And
Right.
that's been quite a striking change up there. Yeah. So, yeah, we mentioned how the water kind of has been coming up at a constant rate. The SGS has measured it, and they put a plot on their website. This is from their website, showing the kind of fairly linear, maybe a slight curve, slight. Um, I don't know. It's filling pretty linearly. Yeah, and it's just going and going and going. It's taken a year to get over halfway now. I guess a year from now, we'll be surprised if it hasn't stabilized to some degree, but we'll have to really wait and see. right? How it all, we don't really know how it connects to the water table surrounding there. So that's a big question. And the other thing to kind of mention with the water is that all that water that's not just visible in a pond, but also percolating the entire summit region is absorbing a lot of the gas, we believe, right? And so there's not a whole lot of gas coming out of the summit of Kilauea, which is making that lake somewhat acidic. But then the acidic lake's reacting with the rocks, and that's giving it its color. That's kind of the short version of it all. And so the summit's really in the last 2 years has really changed. Nothing. There's been no activity as far as lava. It's been all the water filling in and not a whole lot of gas.
Right, and
So
did you get into the SO2 scrubbing?
I mean, just very briefly, just the fact that the
Okay.
water is there means that the sulfur is trying to come up through it, and so it's getting dissolved in the water, and that's what they means by SO2 scrubbing, right? And that's really why we're not seeing the same rates at the surface. And the USGS is still working hard to try to figure out exactly how much is getting sucked out, but it's probably it's some significant amount. It seems like, and we
Right.
know the magma is down there, and we can't see the gas.
Especially when you compare this to historic norms of what we've encountered, especially during the Pu'u'o decades of SO2 emissions from the volcano, where now we're at some of the lowest emissions since emissions being taken and not just
Since they've been measured.
right since they've been measured,
Yeah,
and now we're seeing them at that rate but consistently low. Like, and they've
right.
been
Yeah.
low
So yeah,
since the end
yeah.
of the eruption almost.
Yeah, there was almost more variation earlier on, right, when there was possibly less water, right? And the most recent measurements have all been fairly low at around 20 tons a day or so. And so, in comparison, like what Dana's saying, in background before the collapse might have been 10 times that amount, 200 tons a day. And there were times when it was putting out 2,000 tons a day. So it's really, really, really low
Right, and then
for
when
sure.
we compare to even the 2018 eruption and why it was so legendary is that just the SO2 emissions alone were somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 what was it, metric tons a day.
Yeah, yeah. There've been revisions to how much came out of the ground during eruption. It's record setting for sure. Yeah.
Definitely.
So it's interesting because we talked about the emergence of this lake up here at the summit of Kilauea, but there have been a lot of changes down in Lower Puna. Reflecting at the landscapes that have changed down there, including losses of lakes. In this case, we're having some ponds form where we had the ocean down at Pohoiki, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about Pohoiki. That we were really worried about during eruption getting affected by that lava itself. We'll show you guys like the last little stages of lava into the eruption there, but it was really the post-eruption story of the sand, sand that was formed both from lava going into the water, but also from the continued erosion of that whole new shoreline between Poho and all the way to Pohoiki, all the way around. Pummeling that black lava rock, turning it into sand, the currents bringing it around and pushing around to kind of block the bay. So I'll turn it over to Dan to kind of talk through the changes of the sand as it accumulates here.
Right. So you could see first and foremost that in the original picture before the lava came, how different it was down at Pohoiki Bay, including the shacks, bowls areas, the surf spots, and then the lava claimed those areas, even claimed dead trees surf spot, pushed into what is called elevators. I'll try and draw these right here. Pushed into first bay, second bay, third bay, even past that, right? So it continued down for a considerable amount of time, and you can see how thick this is, right? It's over 400, what was it, yards thick? Or 400 feet, I can't remember.
I believe feet. I believe,
Feet,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
feet.
And you kind of see that actually in those last few frames, it kind of stabilized as far as how wide it was. Right here's animation being put together from meticulous studying all those videos showing that extent.
Right, and you can just see how the sand progresses over time. And then, especially near the end, it starts to hit an equilibrium near first and second bay nearest the boat ramp. Now, the boat ramp is the only boat ramp on this side of the island that's still that exists. So this
Right.
was the only way to get in the ocean. Now there is no way to for boats to get into the ocean down here because of all this sediment that's moved in. And you can see we call it a beach, but there's plenty rock down there.
Right. Right.
Especially more recently. This is one of the more recent trends we've seen in the past 6 months, a year, is rock accumulations along the shoreline as opposed to more sand content. And
Right.
this has just
Right.
continued to compile. This is now the boat ramp that you're seeing, and now you're seeing kind of these warm slash hot ponds that are capturing the geothermal energy from further up the rift than the water table, and how it percolates down to the shoreline to create these ponds that have been sealed off that once were in the bay. And the sand just trapped them, so they rise and fall with the tides. But they're heated by the water coming through the water table. So some of these things are at the heat that you would expect of a hot tub, right? On the right day with the right conditions, it'll feel like a hot tub in one of those ponds. Certain ponds, right?
Yeah. These are areas that have had springs even before the eruption. Even within the bay, right? The surfers that enjoy the springs coming up. So now that the sand is there, they're kind of coming up through the sand and kind of puddling in the backside where there's still room to collect, right? And just like those old ponds had variations in temperature based on rainfall and other factors like that, we're also hearing variations in temperature of these ponds kind of at the edge and the backside of the beach as well.
There was an old pond out in here that it used to fluctuate just as he's saying, and now these new ponds act very similar in how they rise and fall with the different conditions, the temperatures on them.
Yeah, but we do know the heat's moving around, right? We know that after the eruption that the temperature is spreading, right? So the heat is radiating from those cooling lava bodies underground underneath the East Rift, all the way up the rift zone, right? And we can kind of see there, that we certainly expect it to heat the groundwater all the way to Pohoiki. But what we didn't possibly anticipate, but what did happen, is that heat from those areas has been spreading outwards and reaching farther distances from the fissures than before. And so it's affecting more houses in those zones that are marked yellow that Dane's highlighting, that one now with the pink. Right there in Leilani, there's an area over at Halema'uma'u, and there's an area over by Allahili, which is actually not near any of the eruption. We'll show you guys some video of that here shortly as well. But what's going on there is that, while you had a much hotter temperature right where the lava was coming out at the time, there wasn't enough time for that heat to kind of spread across side to side away from the dike towards where that house is drawn in the diagram up there, right? So what's happened since then is that the actual dike itself has cooled, but it's done that by spreading its heat farther out, farther away. So even though right at the spot where the eruption happened, it's much cooler, farther away, the temperature's actually gone up because that's where the heat's gone to kind of spread out. And so people who are kind of not super far, but still farther from the fissure than they originally thought was the risk, are now experiencing these areas of heat. And so let's play the video for them, Dane, and have them see what it looks like in one of these areas of Allahili. This is an area that USGS reported that they thought might actually erupt at one point in time. So it's putting out blue SO2 smoke. And so we know the magma came very close to the surface here. In fact, Highway 130, just east of this location, we thought the magma was underground, not very far, according to their model. What was it? Do you remember, Dane?
Like it was 200 feet.
200 feet, something like that? Yeah, so really not that far underground.
Like
so this was not officially an eruption, but the magma was right there, and so not surprising to see gases in this area.
And one thing that we've seen since the eruption ended, I'm going to pause this real quick, but the steam started in this area called Allahili that we're going to show in a second. It started, say here, along this this line. And then since the eruption ended, we've seen this migration of heat as it spreads further in the direction I'm drawing, right? Mm-hmm. So this is one of the areas that we're now highlighting in this drone video right here.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can see the steam coming up, and it is mostly steam, but you can still smell small amounts of H2S mixed with dead vegetation, and you can see this line going up the rift that is been growing since the end of the eruption, and it doesn't have to do with much magma movement other than it's settling and what's kind of in the expected of the profile of how this the end of the eruption. Since the end of the eruption, right. Kind of what we've come to see, and this is a road. The road that you were seeing there was actually a road that was put in during the eruption as an emergency access around where Philip was talking about on Highway 130, where the lava had come up close to the surface. They put steel plates down to be able to allow traffic to bypass, but that was at one point the only way out.
Yeah, you guys can see a lot of houses in this video. One other thing, we want to talk at great length with the county of Hawaii does have a Kīlauea recovery program now, and they have proposed to assist people who are being affected by these gases, and not just the ones who are affected by lava as well. So that's kind of a whole different story. We won't talk about it any more than that necessarily. But that is another part of the story that's happened, is that we're still dealing with recovery and how to people who didn't feel like they were at risk originally from the original eruption 2 years ago. Now their house may actually be under more threat in areas like this, especially.
Right. So changing topics again. Let's get back up to the summit of Kilauea.
Yeah, because we're going to turn a little bit more to the science signals, right? The GPS signals and the big picture story, right? And the big point to make is that there's been some research done by the USGS scientists, and one big question we had at the end of the eruption in 2018 in August after the last collapse was, well, how much magma is left? Is the thing actually empty? And so, we might have at the time said that, and speculated that it might have been all the way empty, but in fact, the research points out that the magma chamber was at least 2/3 full and possibly 9/10 full after the eruption was over, right? So that they put that in different terms. They said only 11 to 30% of the magma chamber was evacuated, emptied, right? That's what was published. And all of the pictures there are just that's the model they use to kind of get to that number, right? The parameters of how much the ground actually sagged on the surface to cause that effect, right? So the point of that is that we didn't have to refill a magma chamber from scratch. We were filling it up only, at most a third of it, and possibly only 1/10 of it, till we get it back to the stage it was before. So if we look at the GPS, we'll look at the summit line first, right, in this top graph here, and it's showing the distance across the summit from Wikahuna to Crater Rim. And this is a 5-year plot. So what you're seeing on the left side of it is the stability of eruption before the 2018 eruption. That's the summit eruption era, and then you kind of see the big drop down. That's the 2018 eruption itself, and you can kind of see that the timing works out. If you look at the axis on the graph there, right, that's basically between May and August right there. So by September we're already in recovery mode, and we're doing a slow long recovery of that blue line that's kind of climbing upwards between September and about March 2020, right? At the very end of where Dane just drew there, it actually flattens out a bit, and that's like a little detail, but that's the kind of thing we're looking for to as an indication, as a hint. There's no guarantee, of course. This thing is, we're just trying to interpret it the best we can. But that era of stability there may have been some new stage of the volcano, right? Where maybe it's full enough where, not to say they can't fill more, but it's full enough where it can now transfer more magma, more energy down into the rift zone, which we believe is happening. We'll give you some evidence for that later on. So the point basically being that in the last couple of years, we've had a recovery, and more recently in the last few months, a stability at the summit. Looking at the rift zone, it's a little bit of a different story, right? Because the recovery era phase might be a little bit shorter because there was not a huge magma chamber there, even though there's a lot of lava came out of the ground, and the ground was really deformed underground. It's not like you had a giant hole there like you'd had at the summit. So you might recover from it a little bit quicker, and what we're seeing is spreading between the stations across the rift zone. And that might be two things, as we've always kind of come back to, and we still have a combination of these things today, as we said at the end of 2018, one being the south flank movement itself. Probably the biggest factor in the last 2 years has been the south flank sliding towards the ocean after the 6.9 earthquake we had. That kind of still has aftershocks ongoing now. The second thing being that magma could actually push into it. And so what you might see is like a baseline of the south flank moving, and you might see deviations, excursions, where you see magma actually moving. Both things are plotted together and expressed as a rift zone spreading apart. So that seems to be happening as well, right? The rift zone, whatever it had lost, it's still active, and magma is flowing through there. And it doesn't seem like it's going to come out of the ground anytime soon, but it's showing a pulse, so to speak.
Right, and there's also one added caveat when you're talking about these two stations on the bottom that we're looking at, the Pu'uo'o stations that cut across the rift zone and across the Pu'uo'o crater, is that we've seen a tremendous amount of settling in that area, localized settling around the cone, which includes stations that have been basically decommissioned due to the amount of localized settling immediately in the area around the cone. So some of this is that there's just an added caveat when we're looking at these particular stations here, and we've noted this one previously many times.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's pictures of instruments dangling by their wires into the crater still, right? So
right.
That's
just a small caveat that we're to add on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that reminder, Dane. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, we have way more data than that. This is a lot of data plotted on one screen, but what I'm going to break it down for you guys here so you can kind of understand what's going on. All I've basically done is taken representative sites and kind of plotted them in patterns. So we're going to look at this in kind of rows. The very top row, there are 4 summit stations. That one is Outlet, Wikahuna, Crater Rim, and Byron's Ledge, right? And they basically show a similar pattern. They basically show that what we just talked about farther up, where we have that initial collapse during eruption and a kind of a slow recovery, and possibly the very last couple months we'll see the stabilization. Now, these plots are 10-year plots that we're looking at now, from 2010 to 2020. So that little period of time is a lot shorter there at the end of that bar, right? And they might have to zoom in to actually see that same pattern. And it's interesting to kind of look at where that appears in different places. You can kind of see that we have stability coming across the board, but it's not as fast in some areas as others, right? The middle line there, the middle row, is stations on the East Rift. And these are all sorted also from west to east. So it's the one on the left of the picture is at the west, the one on the right is on the east. And so looking at that middle row, the very left one is a Kananui-Ohamo station. That's by Makapui. The one right next to that is Kamoamoa, Kamo. The one right of that is Pu'u Crater. And next one is Jacuzzi, south of Pu'u. Those are the 2 used for that last plot. And Jonica, they're on the right. Jonica is our furthest east station we have on an East Rift Zone. And one thing you can kind of look by laying out the plots like this is that little wiggle at the top right of that area that Jane highlighted is different on the east side of the Rift Zone than it is on the upper East Rift Zone by Kananui-Ohamo and that other station up there, right? So there definitely has been more variation at Jonica. USGS has noted that we've resumed the levels we had in March, but we did have an unusual excursion in the last few months where there was a little extra fast movement and then it kind of slowed down and now it's going to cut back up and it's going to resume its usual pace, right? So there's extra adjustments happening in there, right? So that's another reason to kind of believe that there's some magma doing some pushing in there, and not just the fact that it's happening so long from the time of the eruption, but also the rate of it is the important thing as well. So we had closer to the eruption being over, similar kind of rates, but at that point it was more recovery, and now we can kind of say it's been long enough. We don't expect that to be still recovering from that initial collapse, and now it's more likely a magma signal.
Yep.
Right, and the very bottom row there to kind of finish it off. That row is all the south flank stations. It's the same thing west to east. So the one on west is Salina Pali, and all the way east to the Kalapana Trail, right? And of those, each of these is showing 3 kind of lines, right? The middle line of that plot is the one that's showing south movement. So you can kind of see the south flank is moving south. The earthquake happened, it kind of resumed moving south, right? And the farther east you go, that line that goes after the earthquake is steeper down, like Dane is drawing it steeper, which the south flank's moving faster. And so that doesn't seem to have changed either. It's had a little variations and wiggles we referred to in the past, but it seems like the big, large scale picture is that the south flank is really still moving quite fast, and that's been referred to by the SGS in updates as well. So the bottom line, is that we've had at the summit that period of recovery, and it seems that now we've reached an equilibrium there. In the Middle East Rift Zone, that equilibrium might have been reached a little farther ago, and so we've seen more wiggling back and forth from magma. South flank is still trucking along to the right there, on the right of that diagram. And this is important because we've, since June 2020, USGS has noted an increase in earthquakes in the Upper East Rift Zone. And before 2018, this is something that always happened when there was extra pressure, and it would lead to something like more lava at Pu'u'u or possibly a new fissure outbreak if you had it going on for long enough or strong enough, or a change in eruption vent or something like that. Like that's something that often happened, and it was indicated by enough pressure in Upper East Rift Zone to actually cause this kind of elevated pattern of seismicity. And so the fact that we're seeing this again now in June of 2020 is an indication that the magma is made it around that bend that Dane just drew, right? And it's pressure that's another part of it. Let me kind of back up there. There's a bend in the rift zone, right where that kind of corner of the diagram is, right above the word rift up there, where we have the pattern of earthquakes on the summit at the surface goes at Mauna Ulu, it bends east, right there. And so because it's a curve and the magma is trying to turn around the curve, right, it's going to make that bend. They can pressurize one part of the rift zone different from another part of the rift zone that's got a different trend to it. So the upper part is the one that usually trembles and then it kind of releases and flows into the southern part to kind of relieve it, so to speak, right? And so we saw this pattern of earthquakes on Upper East Rift Zone in June 2020, right? Also some under the summit caldera as well, they're associated with that as well. And then it wasn't that long afterwards, in the last few weeks, that we started to have bigger South Flank earthquakes, and South Flank earthquakes that seem to be located along that fault at the very bottom down there, where the word faults is, right down in there. That's kind of allowing the rift zone to kind of refill. And because the South Flank is moving so fast still, it's just sliding out of the way and allowing it to happen, and that happens and expressed by earthquakes. And so that's at least a working theory that makes sense. Of course, we can't see underground. There could be other explanations for the way the data actually sets up, but that's what makes the most sense. Is the magma is pressurized upper east rift. It's quaking in there. It's pushing. It's essentially it's stiffening. It's pressurizing the whole east rift zone at this point now. And from what we are told by the USGS and the reports, the area it kind of extends down mostly as far as the area west of Highway 130. That's the area that was an Allahili video. It doesn't seem to quite reach as far, at least so far, as Leilani Estates area. Anything to add there, Dane?
Nope, I was just having fun drawing on the thing.
All right.
All right, so moving on, let's get to some of the earthquake activity that we've seen before the eruption, kind of the background level that we were looking at during the Pu'u'o days, the summit lava lake at Halema'uma'u, and all that's kind of included in this graph. And then we get to see the tremendous amount of, 65,000 earthquakes. Right down, never mind. There was hundreds of earthquakes a day, up to 1,000 earthquakes a day, I think, in this period here. Then we come off of the eruption in September, August, and you can see this elevated level that's been riding through since 2018 for the past 2 years, comparatively to the previous levels of seismicity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so a lot of that is the South Flank moving. Yeah, I think you actually were right. Yeah, I think it's something like 60,000 or 70,000 earthquakes in 3 months.
Right, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. So depending on what threshold you use, because that obviously makes a difference.
Right.
But yeah, as Zane points out, the activity is elevated, and it's interesting that the plot right below that kind of gives us a little bit of a breakdown. Right, we kind of see beneath the big bars an upper plot, like that's when the eruption actually happened. So you can kind of see that there's been a lot of activity ever since then as well, right? It's kind of hard to even make anything out. We can kind of look a little further down, a little deeper down though, and look at that blue band at 30 kilometers depth in that middle plot, and that's the plot that we'll show you on a map is actually over by Pahala. That's those deep earthquakes. They kind of get lumped into this plot as well. And what you can see is they actually have been happening at least for the last 5 years, pretty consistently. Definitely, they were happening less so, even though they were happening pretty often beforehand. And you can see that in the last few months, it does seem to have been an uptick, and they're kind of all stacked in each other. It's a lot more black on a plot in that band right in there, just because there's so many edges of those little circles being drawn on each other.
Yeah.
So that's interesting as well, right? It may be that the background level is also including that, but the South Flank is clearly active, right? And maybe it's interesting. We have a slight shift in a balance, perhaps. Maybe not as many small South Flank earthquakes, but we're having bigger South Flank earthquakes, it seems like, as well, more frequently. So maybe that kind of all balances out as far as how much energy is released through the process.
And we've only had one post-eruption 5.0 plus, I believe, a 5.3 on the South Flank.
On the South Flank, I believe it was a 5.3. Yeah.
So we haven't seen the big ones, but we've seen more of the 4s and 3s and things along those lines.
Right. Yeah, I think those are on that map. It might be those yellow circles right there in the middle. Might be those bigger magnitude events on the South Flank there, the Kīlauea South Flank pattern. So you can kind of see, that whole band that it's along. That's the South Flank. The South Flank bend, and then kind of the upper part of the curve up there. That's the Upper East Rift section of it, right? And so it's actually interesting because there's not so many earthquakes happening on the East Rift, right, as they're happening on the South Flank, just south of the East Rift. Like the way you drew it right there.
Yeah. Because
now we're showing earthquakes in the Upper East Rift as well, and that's what we're referring to earlier in the update. We're talking about the quakes right above working your way around that bend in the rift zone to allow magma to keep moving into there. So Mauna Loa.
Yeah, changing over. So what was the impacts? We know that Kilauea is buttressed against Mauna Loa. We saw in the eruption. One area that was of interest was, so little background. During this period here, Mauna Loa is at yellow active advisory level, and it's been at that for years. Then we get to 2018 and the beginning of the eruption, or I guess it would be March, April, so here-ish to here. You can see this backing off of the seismicity on Mauna Loa, corresponding with the eruption in 2018 on Kilauea. And then
That's interesting.
after the
Actually,
eruption,
actually, a little bit ahead of time, a little bit ahead of it, also, as you pointed out,
right,
right? That's really interesting, right? It kind of slowed down ahead of time, but yeah, there's like that gap really corresponds to it. Yeah, and go ahead, and after the eruption is much different.
right, and then we end the eruption, and then we start seeing this. This was October 2018. It was like, okay, what was that? And then it kind of came back, but it kept elevating, right? We had this elevation, this trend going up. And then somewhere in here, Mauna Loa got upgraded back to yellow because it was at an elevated rate compared to what the background levels were determined to be. Basically, this was right in here. I got too many lines going. I look like John Madden right now. All right, so let me get some that cleared up. Right, so right in here, we had that break, which was basically determined to be Mauna Loa at background levels. And then we went to above background levels. And since then, we've been at yellow. We saw this little back off more recently, but it trended back up. We thought it maybe was starting to calm down, but never mind.
Yeah. So I mean, one working idea is that as Kilauea kind of stopped leaning on Mauna Loa so much by releasing the south flank, that magma within Mauna Loa could actually rise and kind of it could inflate and swell itself in that manner, right? And so that could well be what we're seeing there is that pattern of earthquakes. If you look at that second plot below there, where the depth plot of it, you can see that a lot of those earthquakes are really quite shallow. They're really the red band at the very top of that plot, right? So it may be the magma is rising within Mauna Loa, and it's basically it's kind of just stressing, it's just quaking the rocks. And this is nothing to be concerned about because this is a normal operation, right? It just kind of pushes against them and kind of cracks them and moves them around, right? But it's not to the point where it's actually going to erupt just from that. The rocks have a lot of give, right? It's almost like bending a piece of wood or something. The earth can actually expand and adjust and accommodate a lot of movement until it actually fails and magma actually would come out. So we don't really know if actually that was an effect, but there's a really interesting correlation there in time between the eruption of Kilauea and what happened to Mauna Loa, right? And that's kind of one aspect of it is the actual just the raw earthquakes counts, also the depths of them, right? We can kind of show everybody where those are actually occurring on a map view.
Right,
and
scroll down to that. Boom.
Yeah, and they're all at the summit. This is kind of what you can see from this view that you couldn't see above, right? Different parts of the summit. So all shallow under the summit, and this has happened before other eruptions of Mauna Loa. So it's still very much on the table that Mauna Loa could be building an activity. So it is building now. Whether it'll lead to eruption, that's just another thing we'll have to wait and see.
Right, and just a little historical context here. When we're looking at Mauna Loa historic quakes, there's two predominant areas that are outlined in pink, just south of the caldera and just west of the caldera, a mile or so away, close distance in proximity to the caldera. And then the caldera was more of a scatter plot. It was more less consolidated around the summit, but you can see in the more recent, in the past year, how these three areas look pretty well distributed between them in terms of the shallow earthquakes, which are represented in red, and the more deeper earthquakes.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely something that's that's of concern. It's not like a high alert concern, but it's something to keep an eye on for sure. Right. And that's something that we see in the GPS as well, right? If you look at the rates of GPS movement, it's actually the actual spread at the top of the volcano is a pretty good rate, right? It's not like at alarming rates, but it's at a pretty good rate at that right side of the graph, being pretty steep over there. The eruption, as Dane marks out there in the middle, was an area of relative quiet as well. As you can kind of see, the GPS was also not spreading during that time. No earthquakes. The volcano wasn't swelling at all. Maybe it was kind of just, staying out of Kilauea's way in some manner of speaking, right? And then since then, it's adjusted. So, but one thing that you actually can say is the rate since the eruption is a lot higher than the rate before the eruption, right? So it's kind of following a similar pattern of the earthquakes as well. And so that's something to keep an eye on, and we'll have to wait and see, right? It's rising very slowly. U.S. Justice saying that there's still slow summon inflation consistent with magma supply to the shallow storage, right? So the magma is going in there, and it doesn't have to erupt for that reason, but the more it gets in there, at some point, it's going to have to. Right. So that's what's coming in Mauna Loa at some point, and not any short term, but inevitably in our future.
Right. And you can see just two small differences to note out and why there's two different graphs here. They are the same station, right? One is the MLSP. But the thing is this one's measuring vertical at one particular station, where this is measuring the distance between two stations, right? It's measuring across the caldera. And that's the only difference between them. They both are indicating inflationary trends. In terms of the interpretation of they're different, they're measuring different components, but they're still determining inflation on how these trends are progressing.
Yeah.
All right.
So we'll wrap it up. I mean, I think we've kind of from a pretty generalized level kind of covered the biggest changes we've seen in the last 2 years, right? If we know that Mauna Loa is still swelling, right? Here's a pattern of eruptions in Mauna Loa in a historic record, so we would be silly not to be preparing for that at this point. The same is actually true in Kīlauea, right? It's kind of the most recent development in Kīlauea is similar. Activity in Upper East Rift Zone. We still have deformation that's showing the summit in Middle East Rift Zone having magma supply and being stored in a shallow area, right? So kind of, back to 2018, right? August 2018, we were wondering, was that going to be the end of the eruption? Yes, it was the end of the eruption. There was a little bit more lava briefly in September, but that's been it ever since. We've had the longest pause in lava ever since. Right? We're wondering like how much the caldera had emptied and how quickly it would take to recover. Well, it was somewhere in the range of like 1/3 to 1/10 of it, and it's taken about 2 years to recover. It looks like it seems like we're not all the way back where we were for sure, but we're on our way to getting there. Where we still see the pulse, we see the earth moving, magma's moving underground. It's actually causing Upper East Rift Zone activity.
Right in here.
Yep. We have not seen lava at Halema'uma'u summit. Instead, we've seen the pond, which is growing and continues to fill, and we expect to see that until lava comes back.
Right. We went from, just going back up a second, we went from lava, like in this image here, lava lake, to no lake at all, to water lake, wherever we have that video. Yeah, but it was just the progression of the ponding. That's what's so interesting about it, is how you can go from a standing lava lake for years to a standing water lake in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, and now for over a year. So now it's going to be possibly for years as well, right? We'll see. Right. It's going to be a race, whether that lake can fill up or whether magma comes back to the summit, and we'll just have to wait and see at that point, right? And the last thing we're keeping our eye on is Pohoiki, right? That seems to have actually stabilized, from last year to this year. It hasn't been a huge amount of change in the actual extent of the beach, but more so in the composition. And that is good news for the fishermen who are looking for some path to restore their boat ramp at some point in the future. So many changes.
Yeah. Michael Phillips points out, he says, watch Allahili surprise us. I'm like, it's 2020, nothing's going to surprise me at this point. Watch the aliens land, and just stoic face it, because, man, this year, oof.
Yeah. We'll leave that for another update. All the other surprises that could come, whether it's from volcanoes in Oahu could erupt underwater, So, but we don't need to go there at this point. Right. We kind of, we've looked into our crystal ball. Like, if I could have, 2 years ago, given myself this video to give myself all the answers, this is what I would have done right here. And so, here it is for you guys as well.
All right.
So thanks guys for catching up. Yeah. Thanks, Dane.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Until next time, we'll be watching the volcanoes and whatever else comes our way.
All right, guys, stay classy.
All right.